Welcome to Planning and Preparedness, Coping with Adversity and Crisis. The reason why this presentation has been so successful over the years and why we talk about crisis so often is because most people find themselves in crisis. And when they're in that particular situation, they haven't planned for it. They tend to be more reactive. They tend to escalate with the situation, power struggle with the situation, and ultimately make the situation worse. So through this presentation, what we are going to do is help you to identify points of resources, of advocacy, so that when crisis does happen, you're prepared to deal with it, so that you can de-escalate it and it doesn't become a long-term issue. A big component of getting out of crisis is having the ability to change the situation. Once the situation has been made worse, either due to escalating the situation or engaging in the situation, it tends to take on a life of its own and become long-term. At that point, we've left crisis, and that's a pretty big danger zone. So this presentation is going to help to keep you out of that. All right. So some objectives. Again, we're going to define crisis. What is it? For most people, crisis is a life-altering event that is catastrophic in nature. Catastrophic is very subjective. What happens for one person and what happens for another is not the same type of crisis. It's a large spectrum. On a micro level, crisis can be completely world-turning for one individual. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're facing the same crisis as another individual that's more on a macro level. They're different, but they are crisis nonetheless for that particular person. Their life, their daily ability to function, the people they love have been affected in a negative way. We want to understand different types of crisis and what to expect. Why is it important for lay people, for parents to understand crisis if you're not a professional working in crisis? Simple. If you understand what you are getting into, what the situation is, what it means, how to approach it, what the definition overall is, you also know how to react. A lot of people in crisis escalate. Once they escalate, they make the situation worse. And of course, you want to know what to expect. When we're in crisis, it feels like the world is ending and like we are never going to be able to escape that ending situation, that life-altering situation. Once you're in that hole of hopelessness, it is extremely difficult to come out of that. If you know what to expect in crisis, that you are going to have an escalated moment with a point of unsureness and not feeling safe, followed by a sense of safety at some point, that is reassuring, and that will help you to get through crisis. A key component of crisis is resources for planning. That's why planning is present in this presentation. That's why planning is always present in intervention presentations. Because if you have resources, you have advocacy. If you have advocacy, you have more than just one leg to stand on. You yourself fighting a large-scale battle is not going to carry a lot of weight. It's not going to hold a lot of credibility. If you have resources, if you have advocates, if you have people that are pulling in your favor, the more people around, the more impact you're going to have, the more likely your desired outcome is actually going to occur. So again, what are resources and how do I get them? We're going to touch on that. In going over the resources, identifying them, and explaining them, you should be able to develop a personal plan, anticipating some of the possible events for yourself, your individual, and different types of crisis that are involved in these plans and how you will deal with them. And of course, you will learn how to de-escalate crisis situations. One of the most detrimental aspects of being in crisis is that people escalate it. They become angry. They feel out of control. They feel powerless. Well, when you're out of control, you tend to grab at threads. You want to seek control. Somebody has taken control away from you. They've taken away your sense of autonomy, and they are now telling you what will happen. No adult, no human likes to be in a situation where they no longer have control over the outcome of their life. So what do? We seek power. We power struggle. Once you're power struggling with someone, you've kind of entered a lose-lose zone. Because at the end of the day, if you're power struggling with a government agency, an organization, or an entity, at the end of the day, you're going to lose. It's very difficult to power struggle with someone when things are escalated. So if you're the calm person in the face of crisis, most likely you will be the successful person. So let's go back to the basics and let's define crisis. What is it? It is one's own perception or experience of an event or situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds your current resources and coping mechanisms. Again, it's subjective. It is your own experience in your situation. And of course, it has exceeded your resources and coping mechanisms. You don't have resources to support you. You don't have resources to validate you or to advocate for you. Your coping mechanisms are no longer coming into place. Your rationality, your ability to plan and be defensive versus reactive has changed. And so once those coping mechanisms are out the window, you've lost your leg to stand on. So how do we intervene with crisis? We define crisis intervention as an emergency psychological care aimed to assist in returning to a normal level, to your initial baseline. Normal subjective again too. Your normal state may still be quite chaotic. There may still be repercussions from whatever the crisis event was. But at the end of the day, you have had a successful intervention if you are no longer in that state of crisis. And the most important aspect of crisis intervention is we are reducing trauma. Crisis has a negative connotation. It is not pleasurable. Nobody wants to be in crisis. Why? Because it's traumatic. If you are able to remove yourself from the crisis situation before it becomes a long-term situation, you have successfully avoided long-term trauma. If the crisis situation becomes a long-term living arrangement or a long-term event, you have continued that trauma. You will constantly be re-traumatized by that crisis because it was never resolved. The intervention was not comprehensive. So the priority of crisis intervention is to increase stabilization, reduce traumatization, and of course to do both, it requires planning. So crisis always occurs at the spur of the moment. Nobody ever wakes up in the morning and says, you know, I'm feeling great today. I think I can handle a crisis. And that's when it occurs. Absolutely not. Crisis happens when everything else is going wrong. And then you have a large-scale crisis, and in the face of everything else, you need to handle it. If you are prepared, handling that crisis will be much simpler. So we're going to look at navigating crisis. I specifically say that crisis is temporary because that's our objective. We want crisis to be temporary. Again, once it becomes permanent, you've entered the trauma zone. But typically, and it's reassuring to know that crisis really only lasts 1 month. Historically, most people will not be in the same crisis state for longer than a month. Even if you passively engage, it will end at some point. That does not mean that you will re-obtain autonomy. Absolutely not. But you will no longer be in that escalated sense of crisis. And the effects of crisis may become long-lasting if not addressed. So these are the effects of them. It's not actual crisis, it's the subsequent effects. The optimal goal is minimize long-term effects and do not power struggle. With a lot of government agencies, organizations, groups, schools, law enforcement, what have you, power struggling is never going to be advantageous. What's going to happen is you're going to escalate the situation and probably create an enemy. And once that person feels that you're trying to take away their power, they're going to power struggle with you to take the power from you. So you've just escalated the crisis situation. What we want to do is learn how to avoid that. So there's various types of various causes of crisis. Again, this varies from person to person, but certain themes tend to set off crisis. Changes in personal life, problems in personal life, problems with families or peers, marital problems. All of these tend to make a person feel out of control and can cause crisis. Things are changing. Your system of support is crumbling. That's a state of crisis. Major life changes, unemployment, loss of an important relationship, the things that matter, that create your social role, define yourself, those have been lost. That puts a person in crisis. Change or loss of structure. We've talked previously about persons with different chromosome variants tend to thrive well in structured environments. Now, if that structure is completely altered into a chaotic form, moving, new schools, that has changed that structure, that has changed that norm. That person no longer is in a normative state. We talked before about how you will return to normal. Well, when you're out of normal, you're in crisis. And then the last few touch on some of the big forms of crisis that I get a lot on the helpline. Depression, feelings of hopelessness. We're entering the mental illness spectrum here. Anxiety, agitation, overstimulation, and of course thoughts of suicide, delusions, or paranoia. These losses of psychological functioning, these losses of pleasure, of happiness, and falling into a pseudo hole or a rut are huge causes of crisis, because it's very difficult to feel that you can get out of them, especially when you feel isolated. And most people tend to use negative coping mechanisms in response to crisis or in response to the unknown or problems. Enter substance abuse and alcohol abuse. This tends to be a common trend as well amongst teenagers in general, amongst a population that feels socially isolated, of course. So we want to plan for what happens should substance abuse or alcohol abuse come into play. And of course, loss or lack of basic necessities. We're going to talk a little bit about basic necessities, but this is perhaps the easiest form of crisis to avoid and the simplest with the appropriate resources and planning to prepare for. So this triangle is a big psychology tool. Most psychologists, counselors, crisis interventionists will touch, or you'll hear them say, something about a hierarchy of needs. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This triangle breaks down the basic needs that people need in order to achieve a sense of safety, in order to achieve a sense of being whole. The very top is the things that we need on a smaller level, our self-actualization. That's really individual to the person, so it's a little bit more difficult to achieve self-actualization. Esteem, of course, we're looking at psychological aspects. When we get to the lower three, those were the first few that we touched on our previous slide. Friendship, family, relationships, and then of course we go into safety. Safety is huge. If a person doesn't feel safe, they can't feel that they can operate within a situation. They've lost one of the most basic needs that people have to have, and of course our basic psychological needs: food, water, shelter. Surprisingly enough, quite a few individuals, especially the adults, enter into situations where they are without some of the lower basic needs, some of the foundation of this triangle. They don't have shelter. They don't have adequate resources to get food, to get healthy food. They don't have medical care. They don't have psychological care, basic needs. Those can be met through various services that we will talk about, and we'll talk about how to obtain those. Moving up the chart, safety. How can you advocate for safety? How can you promote that within your family and within your individual? It is possible, but it's something that you have to be prepared for, because once you escalate safety because you're panicked that your individual doesn't feel safe, they're going to continue to feel unsafe. So we really want to make sure that we're contributing to that safe atmosphere. And of course, things happen within families. They happen with peers. They happen with intimate partners. But how can we avoid that from becoming a large-scale situation? How can we prevent a family argument from turning into an individual running away because they're so escalated? Things like that are what we're going to focus on. And of course, the esteem and self-actualization we're going to touch on when we talk about mental health needs. So types of crisis. Again, we're looking at medical crisis, mental health holds, academic issues, substance abuse, bullying and peer influence, police contacts, volatile and escalated behavior, a lack of basic resources, running away, suicide, and incarceration. Perhaps you may ask, why these types of crises? Because these are the calls that I get on a constant basis, and these are the calls that at that moment are so crucial and in need of immediate intervention. But once that person has passed this threshold and is in this intervention with no resources in place and they haven't planned for it, it's very difficult to backtrack and make resources happen in 2 days, in a week. This is something that requires months of planning, years of planning. And if you've done that work, these will end seamlessly. So how do we intervene? First, of course, we want to assess for safety. Back to that little triangle we just looked at, safety is one of the key components. We want to make sure that we ourselves are safe and that our individual is safe. We need to identify the needs. Are these lower scale basic needs that we're able to address right away? Or are these high scale needs that are going to require professional intervention? A professional intervention, coincidentally, that you have planned for and have in place. And of course, what are your available resources and support networks? Have you developed those? Have you identified those? Have you made connections with those? Have you applied for those? Because at the end of the day, if you need a resource that typically takes a year for acceptance and 2 months to even get an interview, it's not going to be available when you're in crisis. And of course, we want to learn how to process crisis for all the parents out there and the supporters, and how to empower your individual in the sense of crisis, and how to problem solve within crisis. Again, people tend to go with their gut. They tend to respond. I need to do this right away. You need to do this right away. That's not going to problem solve the situation. What is going to problem the situation is having contingency plans, and having a contingency plan behind that contingency plan, and another one behind that, and a safety net under that. That is how you will be able to problem solve. Because if A doesn't work, you better have a B. And B, if it doesn't work, you better hope you have a C. Always plan for the worst, hope for the best. It's a direct quote from Renee, and it's proven to be quite true. And of course, the goals are to reduce stress, reduce psychological and physical trauma, and reduce conflict. We want to de-escalate the situation. Crisis is very easy to escalate. It's easy to escalate because you're passionate. It's easy to escalate because you're concerned, because there's a lot at risk with crisis. And so what we want to do is pull that back, de-escalate the situation, and put yourself in a position where you can be heard so that you have some control over the outcomes. So let's look at step one. Pretty basic. We need to build a support network. And a support network is not yourself and your family members. That's a good start. But a support network involves agencies. It involves already being linked with KS&A, so you're on the right track. It involves contacting your local government agencies, contacting your regional agencies, contacting your state agencies, and making sure that you are aware of all the programs that are out there. You need to know about the different programs, know what they offer, know what's appropriate. And if they're appropriate for yourself and your individual, you need to have applied for those already. A lot of the programs, even if you feel that you don't need them because your kiddo's 5 and they probably don't need housing, you still want to apply for that, because guess what? When your kiddo's 18 and there's a big blowout at the house and they decide they want to live alone, that is not the time when you want to apply for housing. You have wait lists upon wait lists, so all of these networks need to be established ahead of time. You need to have strong documentation. I realize that it's very hard to compile doctor's records, psychological records, school records, assessments, testing that has been done previously, job records. All those things need to be recorded and chronological, and you need to have copies. Because when all the stuff's hitting the fan, you need to be able to provide this documentation. You need to have explanations, and you need to have more than just your word. You need to have other professionals, other persons, and other agencies that are relaying the same thing, that are explaining the same thing. All of the chromosome variant diagnoses are not well known. We run into that all the time. Medical doesn't know about them. Law enforcement doesn't know about them. Judges don't know about them. If you don't have that information readily available and you're saying, well, this is the diagnosis that my individual has, and these are some of the things that go along with it, they're not necessarily going to, well, they're not going to believe you. It's not necessarily, they're just not going to believe you. And if you have information that is valid, if you have information that is signed, that is up to date, and you can hand that over and you are familiar enough with it to break it down for them, that will give you a good leg to stand on. That will give you the ability to communicate what is versus what they think you're telling them. And again, your documentation needs to be organized. It needs to be concise. I can't stress that enough. Go through and highlight key points. If there's a behavior that is pretty prominent that could cause crisis, make sure it's highlighted. Make sure it's defined. Behavioral problem is not defined. You want to have that broken down into very basic terms. Why? Because when somebody is in crisis, if you're waving around a document to a police officer, they're not going to stand there and read 3 pages. They may scan it if you're lucky. A judge may scan it. A lawyer may scan it. That's all they're going to do is scan it. So make it easy to read and easy to understand. So we want to expand the network. We talked a little bit about going outside of just the family and adding different agencies into your network. Again, we're looking at eligibility criteria. So the Department of Developmental Delay is a good place to start. Historically, a lot of the chromosome variant population does not fall within the elements necessary to meet criteria for the developmental delay system. But if your individual does, this is a huge resource to have. They have a lot of backing, they have a lot of resources, and they will help you. Qualifications to enter the Department of Developmental Delay is that your individual needs to have an IQ of 70 or less, or an adaptive functioning less or equivalent to mental retardation. Now, 70 is across the board. This is a federal statute. So what I recommend to most people is if your individual is a child, the sooner that you have them enter the system, the better. Because the likelihood that your individual is going to develop different strategies throughout the course of their life, learn more, maybe test higher, is going to increase as they age. When your individual is younger and all of the developmental delays are present, all of the cognitive issues are present, and they haven't had speech, they haven't had PT, they haven't had OT, they haven't had special ed or academic intervention, that's really when you want to apply for this program, because you're getting a baseline. And that once you apply for this program at a young age, the likelihood of fitting this criteria is higher. So it's definitely something that you want to look at, the sooner the better. And of course, children's services are available for those who meet these requirements. These requirements continue throughout the course of your lifetime, so they can start with basic childhood needs, evolve into adolescent needs, and evolve into adult needs. So the transition with this program are going to be relatively seamless. A big thing that I tell people is this is not like the SATs, okay? We don't want to do a good, thorough night's sleep, no caffeine, fish for dinner, brain power functioning, you're totally calm because you ran a mile. We don't want to do that, because this is not the test that you want to present at your best. What we want to demonstrate is, what is your individual like on a daily basis? Are they going to get frustrated? Are they going to get angry? Did they drink 5 cups of coffee? But guess what? That's what they do every morning, and now they're bouncing off the walls. That's great, because that's the presentation we need to show. Because at the end of the day, if you're showing the best, they're never going to understand what the worst is, why you need their assistance, why your individual may or may not fall within the spectrum. So how do you apply? You want to locate your county office via your Department of Human Services. If you go to any website for whatever state you're in and look up Department of Human Services, there's going to be a link for the developmental disability, for disability agencies, and you're going to click on that link. From that link, you're going to be sent to regional agencies, and those regional agencies are going to be the one that you're going to apply for. So it's county-based, and that county-based agency is going to be the one that you contact and let them know that you would like an eval, a developmental delay evaluation. There is no cost for that, but again, there's a wait list. So developmental disability services, what are they? The agencies are a private nonprofit organization, but they are the single entry point into long-term services and the long-term support system for persons with developmental disabilities. So if your individual has developmental disabilities and you're trying to get, say, community mental health care or an IEP, if you have not already entered this system, qualification as a person with developmental disabilities is not going to happen. Unless this particular agency has stamped you with the approval of developmental disabilities, that title is not applicable to you. This is the only way to get that determination. The state contracts with these organizations to provide non-overlapping geographic service regions. Again, we talked about they're county-based. So if you live in Hawaii and your individual lives in New York, you need to apply for New York services. This is not a federal program like Social Security where you can call an 800 number and it applies for all over.
Maria?
Yes.
I have a question here
Sure.
from Kimberly. Before we get too far down the line, she asks, what about when the school declassifies the child from services?
That's a great question. If your individual has gone through the developmental disability agency, the school cannot do that. The school's role, and we'll talk about this with IEPs, but the school's role is to, how do I put this? If the school diagnoses your individual with a diagnosis, the school is responsible for providing services that are adequate for that particular diagnosis, which is why it's more advantageous for a school psychologist, for example, to not give your person a comprehensive diagnosis that's going to require multiple interventions or multiple specialized classes and services. That individual's goal is to provide what's necessary, but on the least possible scale. They don't have the funding, they don't have the resources to provide multiple things. If you've already gone through the developmental disability service, your individual will be designated as a person with developmental disability. And whether the school likes it or not, they will have to make accommodations for that. If they choose not to, this agency is a great resource because you can go back to them and say, hey, they're not meeting the needs of my individual, and this agency they will send an IEP advocate for you. They will advocate on your behalf. They will contact the school. Your case manager will contact the school. Huge resources that you need to have in place. What do you mean by other health impaired? Hi, Kimberly.
Hi. Hi. I see I'm unmuted now.
Yes.
Yeah, so I am getting a little confused because my daughter is almost 6. She's in 1st grade, and she's had services since she was 4 months old, and we have had an IEP. We came into school with an IEP, and very shortly after she entered school, she was declassified, and has, and I fought like the dickens to get even the minimal amount of services back, and really it's negligible what she's receiving at this point.
Okay. Now, I'm a little unclear. Did the school classify her, or was she classified by a government agency?
She came in, she was receiving her services from an agency called Clinical Associates of the Finger Lakes, so I'm guessing that they're one of these nonprofit organizations designated as the entry point. I mean, she was initially diagnosed in Oregon, but we've done most of her work in New York because we came back to New York when she was very little. But she's had an IEP until a couple months into school last year, and then they declassified her and removed all of her services.
Okay. Well, what state are you located in?
New York.
In New York, okay. Well, my first recommendation would be to go back through the county agency and make sure it's the county agency. To the best of my knowledge, the school cannot declassify her. The agency might be able to, but they'd have to retest her in order to declassify her.
Well, the school did their own testing, and they made a determination that she doesn't need the services.
Okay.
And, yeah.
And that's the big thing that I touched on. The school psychologist's role is to advocate for the school. Okay, yes, they're a psychologist. Yes, they are supposed to identify presenting issues. Their role as a school psychologist is not to diagnose. And so, and as a matter of fact, they really don't have that background, too. So the best thing that you can do is, one, get a second opinion, go to a different psychologist, not through the school, have her IQ tested independently, and go back through your community agency, go back through the Department of Human Services, and ask that she be retested again for developmental disability.
Okay.
And that's a good starting point. Now, if things still don't work out after that, definitely give the helpline a call and we'll re-navigate things. We can kind of switch things up and see what other avenues to take. If she, in fact, doesn't qualify anymore, then we find a different avenue. But we can still have an IEP in place even if she doesn't fit the developmental delay criteria.
Yeah, see, that's our barrier, is that she's meeting school expectations, and that's their end game.
So I'm assuming that her IEP was purely academic.
No, it wasn't. I mean, one of her major needs is physical therapy, and so yeah, no, she came in with a very minimal amount of speech and a good deal of physical therapy, and now we get half an hour of physical therapy a week. And her fatigue is. I mean, I feel like this is getting very specific to me, so I don't want to be too specific. But yeah, so it was not academic. She was always meeting expectations and has continued to do so.
Okay. Well, let's start with the few guidelines that I gave you with the second testing, and make sure you get a second opinion on the IQ as well, okay?
Sure.
And a psychologist, of course, and then, of course, go through the developmental disability services and make sure that both of the outcomes match up or are close.
Okay.
Okay, and if that doesn't work, give the helpline a call or shoot an email to genetic.org, and I'll be able to touch base with you again that way.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay.
Okay, so continuing on, what are these agencies responsible for? What does the developmental disability system do? They're going to do eligibility determination, like we talked about. They're going to assess the IQ functioning. They're going to assess the basic level of functioning and assess that for disability. They're also going to help to service plan. They're going to help you to develop resources. They're going to arrange for services. So like I said, this is a huge component because they're really going to do a lot for you. Here's my caveat to doing a lot for you. You need to know what this agency offers, because if you don't ask for it, the likelihood of them giving you a checklist and saying, hey, look at all the things we offer that could be helpful, check off what you want, is never going to happen. What they will do is tell you that you've reached eligibility and take you on and give you some of the basic needs. If you don't ask for an IEP advocate, they're not going to offer one. So know if your agency does or does not offer that. The more you know about the agency and what they offer, the more you can ask for. And the more you know what's appropriate for you and what you need. And of course, the services that they offer are going to be either directly through their agency or for purchase. Some of the themes are speech therapy, occupational therapy. Depending on your specific county and their resources, they may offer that through their agency. If they don't, they may offer that through purchase agreements through outside agencies that they work for or individual contractors. They're going to help with development of your individual development towards some semblance of independent living or a higher level of functioning. And they're also going to help with arrangement of service monitoring and a variety of other functions. So again, some of the things that I touched on in here may not be eligible in your specific county. It varies and it depends on funding. But still ask and find out if they're available. Also do your own research. And so you know what they do or don't offer versus just asking your case manager if that's available. You really have to keep in mind that these agencies are inundated. The case managers have more than 3 times their caseload. If you aren't able to help your case manager to help you, it's going to be very difficult to get comprehensive resources. And of course, these boards are responsible for assessing the needs and developing plans to meet your needs within your local service area. You can always ask for contract services if they're not offered through the agency. And they play a critical role in managing limited resources. Like I said, these resources are not in overabundance. The funding for these is not so rampant that they're throwing them out. They need to make sure that the resources that they're offering go to the right persons. So in managing these limited resources, you need to ask for them and make sure that you obtain them because they are limited in nature and they cater to an entire service area. So that's kind of large. Other services offered by the developmental delay system. Again, I use may. It depends on your agency. Your child may receive occupational, physical, speech, and behavioral therapy. Behavioral also means mental health therapy. And adults may receive community-based services, which include assistance with independent living, assistance with host homes, group homes, and also some support to pay for dental and eye care services. And at the end of the day, the developmental delay system has more backing than most agencies, so they're really going to be able to help and advocate, especially if you're in crisis and you need somebody to validate developmental delay for your individual. Having this stamp, having this diagnosis is really what's going to be is really what's going to be important to validating the need of your individual or the developmental spectrum that they're on. So crisis behavior. Okay, so let's look at assessing for safety. Big themes that tend to negate safety or to make it more difficult to maintain is looking at our drugs and alcohol involved. People that we love are not the same person under the influence of drugs or alcohol. It's more difficult to de-escalate that individual. They're not in a rational state of mind. And a lot of the times it's really important to remind yourself of that. But also in speaking with somebody who's under the influence of drugs or alcohol, you want to take a different approach. You also want to look at, are you at risk? If the situation is very escalated, it is not the worst thing in the world to remove yourself from that situation. If it's a question of safety, that's really the best thing you can do. If you're around an individual who is in crisis that is highly escalated and potentially is under the influence of drugs or alcohol, standing there in their personal space and continuing to narrow in on their personal space is actually the worst thing you can do for yourself and for them. Because if they feel threatened or if they feel pushed into a corner, who's the first person they're going to lash out on? Of course, the people they love, and of course, the person that's closest to them. So that could be you. So remove yourself from that situation so that a second crisis situation doesn't occur. Are siblings safe? Are other persons safe? And is your individual safe? Are they safe from harm to self? Are they safe from harm to others? Are they safe from the situation becoming more escalated to the point where it's going to make them feel more powerless and more unsafe? Are there too many people around? Is there too much noise around, too much stimulation? Take those into account. And of course, look at what is the immediate need. If your individual is under the influence of alcohol but contained, is the immediate need to invade that individual's space and have a lecture about alcohol use? Probably not. Is the most important need to give that individual a place to sleep for the night? Yes. Did you just de-escalate crisis? Yes. So really look at the basics of it. What is the easiest thing you can do within this particular situation? And a lot of the times, if you can do that, it's going to bring the situation down a notch. It may not resolve it, but it may bring it down a notch. Resource implementation is the best de-escalation. Do you have a plan? Do you have somebody that you can contact to de-escalate this individual? Maybe they have a friend or a grandmother or a cousin, somebody that they respond better to. Can that help to de-escalate the situation? Look at that as a possible alternative. And of course, where is your individual at? If your individual is telling you, I just want to go to sleep, let them go to sleep. Now, if they just want to go to sleep and you're worried about their safety, then we address safety needs. So what is the actual need? Take both of those questions into account when you're dealing with any crisis situation, okay? And stabilize the foundation of the triangle that we looked at, basic needs, safety, family. Stabilize those first, and then look at what the actual need is of that person at that time. So again, we're going to talk about power struggling. Power struggling is a very dirty word. Why is it a dirty word? Because it makes everything worse. Do you have a de-escalation plan is the ultimate question when power struggling. If you don't, the power struggle will continue to ensue. If you do, then you have a list of steps that you know you can take. When you're power struggling with someone, the first thing on your mind is not a chronological list of steps that you're going to take within the situation, which is why it's really important to write them down. No person is really able to enter a crisis situation and think of a step-by-step process to bring it down. If your step-by-step process involves calling somebody, taking space, or sipping a glass of water upside down, I don't know, whatever that may be for you, if that is your steps that you're going to take, you need to have that written down and you need to follow that because it's going to de-escalate you. It's going to help you stop power struggling. So, things that you do want to do in a crisis situation and instead of power struggling. Allow your person to take some space. Have a designated or planned routine. Why is this important? I know it sounds a little silly, but when your person's escalated, if you tell them, yeah, take some space, and they leave, and you don't know where they're going, you've just entered another source of crisis. Now, if your plan when your individual is taking space is that they're going to go in the backyard, or they're going to go to a neighbor's house, or to their friend's house, or to the gas station up the street, that is a plan. And you've explored that plan with your individual, you've practiced that plan so that they know that's okay, and you respect that. So they can take that space and you know that they're in a safe place. You've contacted the neighbor, and the neighbor knows that they may come knocking on the door looking all sorts of huffy and puffy, and they let them in. Versus the neighbor panicking that somebody's pounding on their door at 2 a.m. Also, are they going to go knock on a neighbor's door at 2 a.m.? Probably not. If that's something that's okay with your neighbor, great. If not, what is plan B? At nighttime, when things are escalated, where can your person go to take some space? Explore that and explore the contingencies. It's a big way to create a de-escalation plan. Again, you want to use choice statements. When people are in crisis, we talked about them feeling out of control and powerless. When you give somebody a direct order, you're maintaining that sense of being out of control, that sense of powerlessness. What you are doing is you're power struggling with that individual. You will do A. Well, they're in the mindset that I don't feel that you're the person that is looking out for my best interest right now. I don't feel that I want to listen to you. I don't feel that the decisions that you're making for me are what I want to do. And your A may be eat a bowl of ice cream, and it's still not going to be something they're going to agree to do. So you want to give options. You can do A or you can do B. As human beings, as adults, as individuals, even as children, we want to have choices. So if option A is you can go into the library or you can go into the backyard, those are choices. They're choices with limits. So, of course, we don't want to open a big can of worms and say you can go do whatever you want to. We want to still be a parent. We want to still be the individual in control. But we want to have a sense of fencing around an open field. okay? And also, we're going to allow time for your person to process the choices. If you give the choice to do A or to do B, it is not going to be advantageous to want a response right away. Your person may ponder that for a while. They may ponder if this is a trick, or they may ponder if they want to engage in your A-B game with you. If you allow that person to have time to process it, you may get the result you want. Silence is actually a good thing. So allow that person to take some silence and process, because guess what? If they're thinking about it, they're thinking about the options you gave them. It's a lot better than a no response. And of course, you want to role play and talk about these things, because if you haven't practiced them, you haven't written them down, you haven't made them routine, it's going to be very difficult to use these themes when things are escalated, or to use these themes when there's anger in place and confusion. So make sure that it's become habitual, that it's become a structure. And I talked a little bit about writing it down. Make a big poster board with it. Post it on your fridge. Post it in the bathroom, whatever. Make sure it's posted at some place in your house, because you need to have a reference point that's going to bring you down, that's going to bring your individual down, something to look at, so that you know the steps that you agreed to take and that you yourself can follow them. And that may be very helpful for you in the long term. All plans that tend to resolve themes are usually written down, because when we're spinning and there's a lot of themes going on all at once, the likelihood that we're going to take a step back and look at themes is just not very consistent. So let's go ahead and promote that by having it written down and kept in various places. And of course, maintain concrete thought patterns. You want to avoid ambiguity in these situations, hypotheticals. They'll confuse things and tend to make them worse. So again, we talked about don't power struggle, don't take away autonomy, don't threaten. At the end of the day, threatening is power struggling. Threatening is taking away safety. It's taking away a very basic need. The individual's response to a lack of safety is to respond with fight or flight. Both of those are very negative in nature. So we want to avoid that, avoid taking away their sense of being at peace and being safe. Of course, we want to avoid restraining, confining, getting into personal spaces. If your individual is locked in a room and you know that they're safe, there's no threats of suicide, leave them alone in the room for a little bit. It's not the worst thing. Kicking down a door and charging into their space is not going to make the situation any better. And of course, we really want to practice something called verbal judo. It's escalating in voice, language, or posturing. If you tend to posture and blow up your chest and get into someone's space, it is perceived as an aggressive response. This applies to more than just your individual, by the way. This also applies to when you're dealing with emergency medical technicians, lawyers, doctors, police, judges, case managers, probation officers, teachers, whatever. If you're posturing and you're blowing up your chest and you're pushing into someone's personal space, you have then elicited that person to respond in the same way. And adult functioning has shut down. If your voice becomes louder because you're passionate or because you're upset or you feel unheard, that person's voice is going to become louder as well. If your language becomes aggressive, if your language becomes profane, that's the response you're going to get from your individual and from other persons you're dealing with in the community. A good thing to practice is keeping your voice at a very baseline level. In fact, almost close to a whisper. If you can picture your nicest phone voice that you do when you're putting your voicemail on the line, try to keep your voice at that level. And practice that in different situations. Practice that in getting a speeding ticket or confrontation with your partner or with your boss. And you will notice that if you maintain a voice level that is constant and that is low, other people's voices will drop too. That's really important, because if you're working with law enforcement and they're escalating and your voice is very low and calm and consistent, their voice will come down. For one, because they can't hear you, and for two, because they want to know if you're saying something that is threatening or is power struggling with them. So their voice will in turn come down to hear you too. It's really a nifty technique. The more you practice it, the easier it is. So practice it with your individual, practice it within your home, and make that a constant. If you don't practice it, you're not going to be able to do it in a crisis situation. Big thing that we talk about relatively often is crisis in academia. We want to look at the different facets that can go on with your individual. They may learn differently, develop differently, think differently, pay attention differently, and certainly react differently than their child counterparts, or even than their counterparts that have chromosome variants. They may act differently than their siblings. We all know this. So what we want to do is see how we can take these elements and apply them in an academic setting so that things don't escalate to a point where they don't need to be. Without support and necessary safety nets, your individual's behaviors and needs can and will be misinterpreted. They will be treated incorrectly, they will be misunderstood, and they will result in the deprivation of a basic entitlement, which is education. A lot of the times I get phone calls from parents who have told me that their individual has been expelled, and they're no longer welcome within the school district. And this has happened across the board. And the long and short of it is, yes, your child is entitled to education, but if your individual doesn't have an IEP in place, they don't have the safety net necessary to back them into remaining in the public school system. A lot of the times, if it's a low-key issue, you may get requests from the school such as online schooling, homeschooling, and make it seem like it's a very nifty idea for you to homeschool because you can give your individual personalized attention, and you know that your individual's behavior best. So if you're homeschooling, then your individual will get the best education possible from you. Is that something you have to do? Absolutely not. Just because somebody phrases that you can do it better does not mean that you have to. If you would like your person to remain in an academic public setting, they can. So don't be bullied into homeschooling or into online schooling. And a lot of the times you may not have the resources to make these settings most appropriate for your individual. Schools can and will provide necessary accommodations such as IEPs, special ed plans to help your individual to achieve success within the school. So at the end of the day, your IEP is your safety net. If you don't have the IEP in place, like I said, it's not going to cover behaviors. So you want to include cognitive needs as well as behaviors. If you don't have the behaviors and the cognitive needs addressed on your IEP, one will slip through the cracks. A lot of the times with an IEP, the person that's helping you put it together will just put academic elements into it. And there's more to an IEP than that. You can plan for the worst events that could potentially occur, the worst events that you've seen happen. And in doing that, you've created a safety net for if that event should happen, what could you do? Of course, you want to take part in the development of your individual's IEP. You know your child's best, you know your child's worst. You know the most bizarre behavior that they seem to do when they're only around you. If you haven't included that behavior in your IEP, you're not covered with it. So you need to make sure that you're present so that you can identify other facets that you feel might be helpful within your IEP. A really important thing and a great reason to utilize KS&A is because KS&A has listservs. And in these listservs offered through KS&A, you're able to talk to different parents, and also through the helpline you're able to talk with different parents as well that have an individual that shares characteristics with your person. Ask these person what their worsts are. Ask these person things that they've put in their IEPs or things that they've heard happen to somebody else on a listserv, and include those in your IEP. Even if you think that it would never apply to your kiddo, put it in your IEP, because if you don't, and the unlikely event happens that it occurs, you are not covered from it. This applies to weapons, this applies to drugs in school, this applies to fake drugs in the school, this applies to behavioral outbursts, this applies to threats. All of these fall under a zero tolerance policy, and there's more, of course, inappropriate boundaries, inappropriate touching, so on and so forth. All of these fall under your school zero tolerance policy. Take a look at your school zero tolerance policy, as a matter of fact, and take those elements that are in there and include them in your IEP under the behavior element. And of course, like I said, use other parents to resource plan around this. You want to maintain your relationship with your advocate. We talked a little bit about advocates when we were looking at the developmental delay system. They may provide an IEP advocate for you. Also, the school may. At the end of the day, an outside advocate for IEPs is going to be more advantageous for you. If the Department of Human Services or the County Disability Service System does not offer an IEP advocate, I would encourage you to look for one online that is within your area. Usually these are retired teachers or administrative persons that have worked in academia. They're a great resource to have advocating for you because they know what can and can't go on the IEP. They know the language to use, and they know how to really push that. Yes, it's an expense, but at the end of the day, it keeps your child in school, and it keeps your child from having long-term effects, whatever they may be, legal, social, or otherwise. And of course, your child is always present to have you at all meetings which discuss their interests. So if your child is receiving an IEP and you are told that you are not able to be there because it is an administrative issue, insist that you do be allowed. it concerns your child, ergo, it concerns you. So the best resource from IEPs for learning about IEPs and also for learning about how to advocate for your individual with an IEP is www.peakparent.org. That's at the bottom of this slide. So peer influence. We talked a little bit about zero tolerance within school. So again, bullying, being bullied, retaliation against bullies, things that you want to have included in your IEP because they do happen. They happen to most children. And if your children is going to respond, if your child, is going to respond impulsively or respond on a higher escalation level than most, it's absolutely something that you want to have covered. If there's no documentation of previous incidents, this is a big thing with bullying in schools. A lot of the time when individuals are bullied, they're not high risk. They're not physical in nature. Your kiddo did not come home with a black eye, but they came home crying. And you identify that it was Billy and that Billy constantly picks on your individual and torments him. Well, if you handle that on your own, that's great. You've de-escalated the situation. But if you did not report that incident to the school, there is no documentation about that. So when Billy hauls off and slugs your kiddo in the eye and your kiddo responds by bringing a knife to school the next day, and you say, well, Billy's been bullying him for the last year, the school's going to say, yeah, we don't have any documentation of that. So guess what? Because you didn't organize, document, and have a chronological record that you could relay in a situation of crisis, you have lost your leg to stand on. Your individual is now the one that has created a negative situation. So that's why these little events are really important to have documented. And make sure the school has that documented somewhere. You want to talk to parents, inform parents, and educate. It's a little less now, but there's still a pretty big stigma about should I tell teachers, should I tell his friends or his friend's parents, her friend's parents even, about the diagnosis that my individual has. Some doctors may tell you not to, and if they're telling you not to, it's probably because they're uninformed about what this particular diagnosis actually is. If you're aware of what it is and you're aware of how to express that to others, at the end of the day, you're going to avoid misconceptions, you're going to avoid rumors, and you're going to avoid people thinking the worst. Because should it come up, you don't want it to be a shame issue. You want it to be something that you're open about and well-informed about, and others are too. So they're going to know what the diagnosis is, and they're going to know what it's not. It's a good thing to have. It's also going to help with your kiddo with having their peers know a little bit about it. On whatever age level your person is at, if their peers are informed about what is affecting your person, they may also act as an advocate in a crisis situation. So kind of keep that as some food for thought. Same thing with outlying agencies, gas stations, grocery stores. If your person's frequenting those, it is helpful to let that person know what's going on. Why? Because if your kiddo goes in there and steals a candy bar, it's going to be better if they call you versus calling the police. Again, we have planned and averted crisis. It's relatively simple. And while you may think my person will never go into a grocery store and take a candy bar, most kids have. And the likelihood of getting caught is actually pretty high. So what we want to do is avoid that from escalating into a legal situation. You want to know your individual's friends. You want to know the positive and negative about their friends. You want to know Facebook pages. With technology nowadays, things have really escalated to the amount of privacy that your person can have. Historically, we know that a lot of the persons with chromosome variants spend a lot of time online. That's in chat rooms. That's in IM groups. BlackBerry IM, Facebook, Twitter, MySpace, I don't know if they use MySpace anymore, and Xbox chat rooms. And there's more, I'm sure. All of these systems are not monitored. And so if you're not aware who they're talking to and who their friends are, you know, hot guy number 28 may not be who you think it is. So make sure that you're aware of that. Make sure you've spoken to these people and make sure that you know who is on their friend list and block who is not. You do have control over that. And it may not be the most optimal thing for your person. They might get a little angry about that, but at the end of the day, if you save their life, you made a pretty big step. And saving your individual's life from talking to a predator online is one of those crisis steps that's difficult to bounce back from. So again, we talked a little bit about peer influence and how it can be positive. If your individual's friends are advocating for them, if they're aware of things that could trigger and how to move away from those in the most simplest of ways, it can be a huge intervention. So emergency and medical needs. The emergency room is a great resource to have some of your basic needs met. Why is that? Well, because emergency rooms have social workers. and case managers. And those individuals are very skilled at navigating programs and filling out paperwork. Now, with that being said, those individuals are also inundated. So if you're not asking them to help you to apply for certain services, they're probably not going to wander into wherever you are and offer to sit down and fill out a 20-page application with you. If you are hounding them about that before you discharge, it is actually very likely that you will leave there with services. So, again, you want to have present copies of past medical records and diagnoses. This is something you may want to keep in your car. I know it sounds silly, but what are we talking about here? We're talking about planning. And if your individuals rush to the hospital for whatever reason, you're probably not going to be able to go home and grab your case file. So have one in your car, have one in your partner's car. Wherever it is, you need to keep one in the event that an emergency occurs. Have copies, have diagnoses, have that signed off by medical providers. A medical provider is going to listen to a medical provider. It's just the way that it is. Ask to have procedures explained to you. Stay informed and ask questions. This also applies to medication use. Ask what medications are. Ask what they're used for before they are administered. Keep in mind, do not go out willy-nilly screaming that I'm not going to let you give my individual medications, because guess what? You've just created a power struggle. What you can do is ask what the medications are, what they do, and then give some feedback about that, or maybe give some other feedback that may be an alternative to medication use. So again, we're looking at providing what? Constructive suggestions. That same A-B tactic that we identified as using with your individual, you can also use that with an MD, and it actually tends to serve a better purpose. You can also educate them too. If your individual is having a breakdown, it's helpful to let them know that these breakdowns happen relatively consistently and subside in 15 minutes, and these are a couple things that you know that help to de-escalate it, versus your individual being administered a sedative or an antipsychotic. That's a crisis. Your individual has now had something that has taken away their autonomy. You can avoid that with education, suggestion, choice statements, and of course with medical personnel, just like with law enforcement, you have somebody who does not want you to tell them what to do. You are on their turf. You are in a hospital. You cannot tell them that you will do. You want to make suggestions. Even if you don't like the individual that you're dealing with at that moment, which you may not, you want to make sure that you have not entered a place where you are reflecting that to them, because they will reflect that right back onto you. Make sure the mirror that you're holding up to somebody is the same thing that you want to have deflected back at you. Big component of crisis intervention. Like we talked about, great avenue to develop resources and referrals. If there's basic needs that aren't being met or services that you would like to apply for, make sure that you have documentation of need by either the MD, social worker, discharge planner, or case manager. So some of the resources that a social worker may refer you to are specialist referrals. This is specialized care, specialized medical care of sorts, physical therapy, occupational therapy, mental health follow-up, medication assistance, lodging, and food services. It's actually a great resource for meeting your basic needs, or for having somebody to help you fill out the forms and identify the programs to meet your basic needs. The long and short of it is, when you're in a hospital setting, you are without basic needs. So if you are applying for services while you're within that setting, you're more likely to receive them at that time, versus if you're home and applying for services. And of course, services may move faster if you're in a hospital. So if you don't have medical coverage and you apply for Medicaid in a hospital setting, chances are you'll receive Medicaid a lot more quickly than if you apply for it at home. So they will assist you social workers will assist you to fill out service applications, which may include Medicaid, Medicare, and disability. Also, your basic Department of Human Services application, which also includes things like food, housing, prescription coverage, mental health care. Those are some of the big ones. So again, you want to avoid conflict, use good communication skills, use that thing we talked about with keeping your voice a little bit lower so that things don't escalate. And if you panic, your person will panic. If your person's in a hospital setting and people are talking about them, or talking all around them and making suggestions all around them, they're going to feel very escalated. If you start chiming in and trying to raise your voice over these people, you're going to make them feel panicked because you're not in control. And when they see that you're not in control, they become scared. If they feel like you're okay with the situation, things are going well, they'll tend to be more calm. It's kind of like thinking back to when your kiddo was like 2. If they tripped and fell, and you said, "Oh my gosh," and ran to them and put your arms around them and were rocking them, what did they do? They burst out into tears. Now, if they tripped and fell and skinned their knee and you said, "Oh, you're fine," what did they do? They tended to get up and go back and play with their friends. The same thought process applies here. If you don't make the situation seem catastrophic, they're not going to internalize it in that way. If you do make it seem catastrophic, that's the exact impression they're going to get. So resources, Medicaid, some of you may or may not be familiar with this, but it's a health program for individuals and families with both low income and disability. Things have changed recently where a kiddo that's applying for Medicaid, their family's income, their parents' income may not take as much, may not hold as much weight with them in applying for services. This is more so for CHP+. So if your state does not offer CHP+, it's still going to include your income parameters. You do have to include your income on the application. So kind of bear that in mind. And of course, what does Medicaid do? Healthcare program. It's a healthcare program which provides financial assistance for medical expenses based upon medical criteria, age, and financial need. So you still may have a copay. You may not have a copay depending on your income or your individual's income. So what are some of the criteria? Lower income, limited assets, and one of the following, that your individual is 65 or over, blind or disabled, dependent children, pregnant, or pregnant woman and children. The criteria your individual is probably going to fit under is going to be under disabled. So if they've applied for disability services and been approved, Medicaid is something that they're going to receive. If they have not been approved, or if they have not received that disability stamp, then Medicaid is a little bit more difficult to apply for. But it can still be done, so bear that in mind. Okay, so big terms, SSI, what is that? It's a federal program that's going to provide assistance, primarily financial, to persons that are over 65, blind, and disabled. And these are, SSI will serve the purpose of people that have little or no income. The intent of this assistance program is to meet basic needs. So some of those things we talked about, food, clothing, shelter, are going to be met by the SSI stipend that your individual is going to receive. Keep in mind this isn't huge. It's actually relatively small, and this is more along the lines of usually around $600 to $700 a month. Also, the eligibility is that your individual must be medically determined to meet criteria for this, so physical or mental health. Keep in mind mental health impairment will also qualify you for this. There is no link between mental health and the chromosome variant population. However, if your individual has received a serious mental health diagnosis at one point, whether or not it was accurate, that is something you can use to help you get services. So, keeping your documentation, whether you like whatever documentation was provided to you or not, is going to be helpful for you in the long run. So the understanding is that this impairment that is sustained by the individual will last at least 12 consecutive months, or if not longer. And the impairment must prevent the applicant from performing work-related activities. So this comes into your individual having a job. If they've been fired from several places of employment, you want to have documentation that they've been fired and why. If you don't have any documentation around that, what they're going to ask you is, how do you know your person can't work? Okay, so anticipate that these questions could come into play. And the way to apply for this program is there's an 800 number on this slide. You can call the 800 number, you set up an interview, and that's usually done within 48 hours, and then they'll conduct a disability interview. Make sure you ask for SSI, not SSDI, okay? SSI is the program you want to apply for. You want to apply as soon as possible and by your person's 18th birthday. This is the resource that's going to allow your person to subside should anything happen to you and allow your person to subside in some individual capacity. It's a huge program, and it's very important to apply for. If you don't need the services offered from it, you can always turn them down at some point in time. If your individual decides that they can work and are able to work, great. But once you've been approved for it, at least you have that documentation that you were approved at some point. So we talked a lot about documentation. I'm not too sure that I need to go over so much about it, but we talked about keeping your documentation specific. And also you want to make sure that it's comprehensive, that it has hospital records, crisis contacts, and also services that have been obtained. Okay, obtaining services is very difficult. So this is what we were talking about when we were talking about having safety nets and legs to stand on in advocacy. Your documentation is a buffer for you. Make sure you have it. You want to make sure that they're detailed and that they're dated. Okay, that's very important. And also, like I said, specific examples. Behavioral problem is not a specific example. Behavioral problem hits people is a specific example. Okay, or behavioral problem makes threats that are hollow. that is an important thing to have documented. So make sure that whatever records you obtain are specific. If they're not specific enough, ask for clarification. They'll help you to remember events. When you have a lot of things going on in life, it's very difficult to recall what has happened, so you do need to have this documentation in place. And it's going to help you from being less frazzled. Again, when you're in a crisis situation, you do not have all the pieces to the puzzle at that time. So if you have a folder that is pre-made and ready to go, that's something that's going to help you to grab everything necessary. You don't want to have it spread everywhere because guess what? In a crisis situation, you're not going to remember what to grab. And you're probably not even going to be thinking about grabbing documentation. So make sure it is ready to go. And of course, you will be asked for documentation and examples throughout applying for services. You will be asked for documentation and examples throughout requesting mitigation or requesting services or requesting that exceptions be made for your individual. So that's why it's really, really important to maintain this. Again, a lot of the times when I get calls, it's 2 days before something's about to happen, and guess what? Documentation hasn't been maintained. That's why it's important. So the Department of Human Services, why is this an important agency? It's a regulatory agency through the state, through your particular state. It's going to help with the following circumstances: runaways, police contact, behavioral issues at home or at school, as well as suicidality. The Department of Human Services has a somewhat stigmatized reputation. They take away your kid. They open a Department of Human Services case. They make threats. If you have your documentation in place and you know how to express yourself and the situation isn't escalated, none of those things should happen. Now, in the event that they do happen and you still have your documentation in place, you're more able to change that situation to clarify that. So big things that are really important to have. If you contact the Department of Human Services or are contacted by them, make sure you're telling yourself that you didn't do anything wrong. Okay, you are not at risk. You are not being threatened. Remind yourself of that. Otherwise, it's very easy to posture and to escalate the situation. You want to use your contact with this particular agency to educate them so that they will know more about your person should contact arise in the future and remedy future situations, and also to develop your resource network. If they're contacting you because Billy's been skipping school for the last 2 weeks, well, then that's a good thing because now they may help you to develop an IEP. Look at it from the standpoint of there's something that you can get out of these agencies besides a crisis situation. You can locate your Department of Human Services by a simple web search through your county. Google Department of Human Services, your state, your county. The number's going to come up. So crisis prevention. Crisis is the active loss of self-esteem, social support, and power. If you're planning for the crisis, you're going to facilitate prevention of it. You're going to have contingencies in place. You're going to know how to react to them if those contingencies should fall through. And you're going to feel empowered if you've done the planning necessary. Crisis prevention is an active response for maintaining control of situations which are likely to become escalated. Again, if you aren't escalating the situation, you're bringing it down. Okay? Even if it's passively, you're still going to bring down the situation and the level of escalation. And of course, crisis goes hand in hand with a loss of calm. Practice maintaining your calm in the face of adversity, in the face of escalation, in the face of being very upset. So crisis intervention and suicide, this is a very big one. You want to know your community mental health resources, know your 800 numbers, know what their response protocol is. You want to know the difference between local crisis lines and local crisis agencies and non-crisis agencies. Not all mental health agencies or providers are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's a big misconception. And most of the time, crisis is going to occur or suicidal ideations are going to occur outside of business hours. So be aware of what their hours of operation are. Have a written plan in place so that you're prepared if an event should occur. If your person is a harm to themselves or a harm to others, know that at what point you are going to cross the threshold to contacting a mental health service provider or to calling an emergency provider. Because if you haven't established that from yourself, you may react too soon or you may react too late. A lot of the times it's very easy to downplay the issue because you don't want a crisis to occur. Well, if you've waited so long and your person has actually engaged in a suicidal behavior, you've waited too long. You want to discuss the plan with your person so they don't get scared. Most people get scared when they're put into a situation with a possible suicide hold or with a mental health person that's coming to talk to them because they're threatening harm to self or to others. It's a very normal response. If you have explained to your person what could happen in a non-threatening way, then your person's not going to feel out of control should that happen. It's just like taking them to the doctor for a shot. If you make that a threatening atmosphere, every time they go to the doctor, they're going to cry, even if they're not going to get a shot. So you don't want to have all contact with mental health be negative contact. And of course, you want to provide your individual with crisis numbers. Give them the autonomy to call. They may never use them, and that's fine. But if they have the ability to have one more resource when they feel out of control, one more person to contact, that may be helpful. Because some of the time, they're not going to want to talk to you. In fact, most of the time when they're a teenager, they're not going to want to talk to you anyway. So if you have numbers and resources in place with people that they feel may understand them better, by all means, encourage them to use them. Down here is a national suicide prevention hotline. It's 24 hours a day. It is a crisis line. They will not always call for a mental health hold. They'll just de-escalate the situation. That's what they're trained to do. And of course, you want to de-escalate with options. You can call the suicide hotline number, or you can page your therapist. If that's an option, great. You've just given them two options. If they hate their therapist and they hate you right now, guess what? They have another number they can call. So again, we talked about mental health holds and why those are scary. Let me explain to you what a mental health hold is so you can then articulate that to your individual, as well as not feel scared of them should they ever occur. So they're also called safety holds. They're called M1 holds. They're called 5150 holds or involuntary holds. Be prepared for that language to be used interchangeably. It is a non-consensual or involuntary hospitalization which can last up to 72 hours. That does not mean that it will be 72 hours. That means it can last up to 72 hours. So reasons for mental health holds include harm to self, harm to others, or a gravely or disabled person isn't able to care for themselves. A recommendation for extended inpatient care may follow the 72-hour hold. That's actually very important because a lot of people don't know that. If you initiate a 72-hour hold for your person and you do that somewhat capriciously, what's going to happen is if they're evaluated to need a higher level of care, they can be kept for a week or a month or what have you. So do not feel that this is an intervention strategy to de-escalate your person for 72 hours. There is the possibility of the mental health stay extending, okay? That may not be a bad thing because it also offers a chance for stabilization should that be what is needed at that time. Mental health holds can be implemented by a variety of people. That is law enforcement, police officers. Keep in mind, police officers are not clinicians, so their perception of what needs a mental health hold may be very different from actual clinicians. If that's the case, most likely your individual will be home within 12 to 24 hours. Okay, so bear that in mind. Mental health workers, an LCSW, a licensed clinical social worker, psychologist, they can all initiate a mental health hold, and also medical professionals, medical doctors, doctors of osteopathy, they can all initiate it. So if the situation is escalated by panic and a sense that control is lost, it's going to go up. It's going to become more detrimental. Your person's going to feel that they're being taken away. Do not panic. Do not cry. Do not scream, because all of these are going to make your individual respond in the same way. Do not say they're taking you away. Do not say do not take him or her away, because what you are doing is you're telling your person that they're being removed against their will. Make it seem very normal. Downplay the situation, highlight the possible good outcomes. What's going to happen? You're going to get to talk to somebody. You're going to get to relax for a little bit. You're going to get to go to group. Whatever it is that you need to highlight to make the situation non-crisis is really helpful, because once somebody's initiated a mental health hold, they're not changing their mind. So keep the situation out of crisis with your person. What are the objectives of mental one holds? They are not punitive in nature. They're not to punish you. They're not to punish your individual. They're to diagnose, assess, and evaluate the situation, whatever mental health conditions may be present. They're to provide medication stabilization or adjustment, whatever the case may be. Therapeutic stabilization, initiation of counseling services, individual and group therapy. Also, post-hospitalization, you'll be provided with counseling referrals and follow-up, as well as post-hospitalization case management and resources. Basic needs referrals and resource development are also something that can be handled while your person is on an M1 hold in a hospital. They still have social workers who can apply for Medicaid for you, and also basic basic resources which may be necessary at the time. If the term residential living is brought up, what is it? It's an alternative to at-home placement. It may range from 30-day stay to long-term living. It may address a variety of issues, including behavioral, mental, and substance abuse needs. These are specific, so substance abuse, mental health are most likely not in the same situation. And I say most likely, but I use that loosely. Check it out. If you're sending your person to residential living, make sure you know what the program is and what the population is within that agency. Few insurances cover residential living. Bear that in mind. If you don't have Medicaid, this is coming out of pocket. Your insurance is not going to pay for your individual to be in residential care for however long they need. The alternative to not being able to afford it out of your insurance is that you sign over custody to the state. That is a slippery slope and probably not the avenue that you want to go. So what can you do? Make sure that you've already applied for Medicaid and your person has Medicaid as a supplement to you and your partner's insurance, or their own Medicaid if they're an adult. This is what's going to help to fund this program. Should they just need some time to de-escalate their own situations, to be in residential treatment for whatever reason that may be. Remember, this is a voluntary commitment, so this is not like the mental health hold. You can leave whenever you feel like it in most cases. In the cases where it's not voluntary, that's going back to the mental health section, so that's going to be more of a long-term residential implemented by an M1 hold, okay? Residential living that is voluntary, if you send your person for substance abuse treatment in Wyoming at a mental health facility and they leave, they are not required to stay. The facility will not track them down. They will not force them to stay. So bear that in mind if you're seeking services. In looking for a residential placement, make sure you view the facility. Don't just look at the online profile. Go and visit. Ask questions and include your person on the process. Let them take the tour too. Let them meet the individuals. Allow a sense of control. Remember, you're changing the structure. You're changing their norm. So be mindful of that. So crisis intervention and substance abuse, this is something we talked about at the very beginning. Acknowledge that there's a need, okay, amongst all individuals that face situations that are difficult. There's a possibility of substance abuse or alcohol abuse. Identify the link between access and environment. If there's a certain environment that your individual always uses alcohol or drugs in, explore why that is. Is this a social situation that they're trying to feel more comfortable in? Great. Now you know how to explore an alternative to alcohol use. Also look at access. Where is it coming from? If your person is a child, is under the age of 18 or 21, it's pretty easy to nip that in the bud. Is there a drive to quit? If your individual is an adult, or even if they're a teenager too, if they do not feel that they would like to discontinue use of alcohol or drugs, it is very difficult to force that to happen. When your individual is ready to quit is when that's going to happen. In the meantime, it does not mean you're completely powerless in the meantime. In the meantime, what you can do is make sure that the environment in which they are engaging in these activities is safer. Are they at home? Now, I'm not saying promote it at home, but you have more ability to control the situation versus them doing it away from you and in retaliation to you. We're going to look at a safety a question. That's a huge thing. If safety is a question, obviously, yes, you take immediate steps. And of course, is detox an issue? Nowadays, with prescription pill usage and alcohol usage, you have a withdrawal period. So if detox is a potential issue, you want to seek a medical provider to help you with that, and also inpatient care. So what need is fulfilled through the substance in question? We talked a little bit about alcohol use in social situations, how that tends to reduce social anxiety. That's something that can be addressed in therapy. There's an alternative to feeling uncomfortable in social situations and learning how to deal with that is not alcohol. If your person's willing to entertain that, even while they're still drinking alcohol, it's going to give them a choice. So choice A, choice B. Still better than just choice A. Substance abuse treatment centers may be appropriate, and it also may be a necessary intervention. Think to yourself, at what point are you going to elicit the intervention of a substance abuse center? Because if you haven't established that point with yourself, you may let the situation escalate out of control. So law enforcement, big issue, make it a resource. It's the same thing, the exact same thing as the mental health hold. If you make this person the bad person, your individual is going to see them that way too. The long and short of it is that you need to realize that law enforcement are not mental health. They do not know any better. They are not trained to be clinicians. They are not trained to be interventionists. They are not trained to make you feel better or to make your individual feel better. They are made to stop a situation through whatever means necessary, and that is how they respond. They are responsive individuals. So if you elicit a response that is favorable to you, that's the response you're going to get. Make non-crisis contact with your local police department. If the only contact you have with the police department is when things are escalated and in crisis, they're going to have a very definite perception of you, your family, and your individual. And your individual is going to have a very definite perception of law enforcement. They're angry people that come and threaten and escalate the situation. If you've had non-crisis contact with law enforcement, guess what? They've made contact with you. They know how your individual is when he's calm, she's calm, and when the crisis is not present. They've seen you as a proactive and positive community member, and your individual has seen a police officer in a non-crisis situation, in a non-escalated situation, which will make them more likely to deal with them in that same manner should they have police contact in the future. Asked to speak to a ranking member, sergeant, whatever, feel free to bring educational material. Again, make it very concise, very easy to read, and share that with them. Offer to do an in-service presentation. Offer to educate, on some mental health issues that may happen with this population. Present it in a way where it's something that they want to learn about. So again, direct information, make sure it's educational, and make sure it's simplified. Always know the police department, allow your person and the police department to get to meet in non-volatile meetings. You want them to know your individual's name. You want them to know what he or she looks like, his or her address, history, medications, possible behaviors, and most of all, you want them to know that your person is not always volatile. If the police are coming out every time Jimmy's upset, they're going to perceive Jimmy as being volatile all the time. If they know about your individual's diagnoses and they know that sometimes if Jimmy takes pill B, he calms down, great. If they know that if Jimmy puts his headphones on, he feels better, great. These are things that they need to know. And also, if your individual has had contact with the same police officer multiple times in a good way, and he knows to ask for that police officer, the likelihood that a law enforcement officer is going to call up a colleague is actually pretty high, especially if it's with somebody that they don't want to deal with, i.e., anything that has to do with behavior. So the likelihood that they call up Officer Jones, who Billy has met with and done a ride-along with, and knows Billy very well, and he's going to come and Billy's going to de-escalate and get in the car with him and be brought home, that's a good outcome. That is something that you have planned for. Great job. So suggestions, again, allow your person to volunteer, ask that they volunteer, meet some of the officers, request ride-alongs. Ride-alongs are actually really fun. Most departments will do them, and they allow your individual to see police in different ways and get to know them in a positive way. Learn their hours of specific people. Just because you have a deputy's card does not mean he's on call 24 hours, 7 days a week. Most of the phone numbers on law enforcement cards go directly to voicemail, so bear that in mind. Know their names, know their contacts, and know the names of the officers that your individual connects with, and associate law enforcement with people of trust, calm, fun, and friends. Plan for prevention. You know it's the law. Your individual is going to communicate differently, think differently, trust differently, and respond differently. So this means advocacy, protection, support, and acknowledgement by government agencies is important. You want to have that in working with law enforcement, judges, anybody, especially the judicial system. And you want to prevent any unnecessary interactions with unsavory persons. If you're planning to avoid those, the likelihood of them happening reduces. So, identify incidences where police contact could potentially be warranted. Role play those, de-escalate those, and have alternatives for those. Calling Deputy Jones, calling an intervention crisis resource, whatever that may be, and then lastly, calling 911. You have steps to take. Discuss how contact with police should be handled, have a role play and a plan in place for that, and of course practice contact without escalation. If you don't practice it, it's not habit. And minimize the misconception that police contact is bad or always negative, just like with mental health. So incarceration, this is a big one. We hope that it never happens and we try to avoid it at all costs. However, if it does happen, it's a hard thing to backtrack from. So you want to have your records and documentation, diagnoses explanations, medications, and letters, direct letters with contact information. If your person is facing incarceration, these are things that you need to be able to provide. You want to have a guardian or guardian ad litem act on behalf of your individual if you're unable to do that yourself. Speak frequently with persons involved in your individual's case. Keep in mind, if your individual is over the age of 18, you do not have the right to do this, even if they've allowed you to. So that's when having a guardian ad litem identified for your individual will be helpful. And of course, you want to facilitate communication between service providers and persons involved. If he has a mental health provider, you want them to be involved with his case manager within the facility and also his lawyer. Search for alternatives to incarceration. This means mental health care, residential living. If it has come down to the point where incarceration is the only alternative that whomever is willing to entertain, have alternatives that are not jail or prison, because those are a slippery slope. This goes back to meeting unsavory persons. That's what happens. So you want to use your networks and resources to advocate for your individual, document, and most importantly, retain legal counsel. This is not something that you handle on your own. So community resources that are very helpful: fire rescue, volunteer programs, any first responder that may come into contact with your individual are good people to have in mind. There are also points of crisis de-escalation which your individual may encounter, and persons that your individual may go to if in crisis. These are all safe people and positive networks to develop. Local youth hubs, it's an alternative to being at home. It's a time to de-escalate, take the time to visit, educate, and learn about the network, learn if it's a place that you actually want to use. If it is, use it and have that as part of your plan. And also volunteer opportunities may promote community networking and communication. So the 18 and over, this is what we talked about with incarceration. If your individual is over the age of 18, you've lost a substantial amount of ability to intervene. So you want to be prepared for this age transfer by having guardianship in place, wills in place, trusts in place. You want to make sure you have these 3 things in place. Why? Because it's going to ensure your individual security and well-being should anything happen to you. Even prior to the age of 18, it's really important to have these things in place because you never know what could happen. It's going to promote independent and safe living, as well as appropriate money management and the continued receipt of necessary programs. Remember how difficult it was to apply and obtain programs. Once you have them, you want to make sure you hold on to them. And of course, the decision-making capacity and information related to needs and legal decisions. You want to make sure that your person has somebody that is advocating for their needs and also advocating in their best interest should legal decisions need to be made. This is a long blurb on guardianship. It talks about what it is. It talks about what it is not. But it defines your general guardian, your special guardian, and your guardian ad litem. They're all different, and they all hold different capacities. So one will hold a lesser capacity as far as advocating to your individual, or another one will hold more. Keep in mind that the guardian ad litem, separate from the other 2, is appointed by the courts to act in the best interest of your individual. So if you hear that name brought up, that is who they are. That is a good person to advocate with and to speak to. When obtaining a guardian for your person outside of the guardian ad litem, you want to make sure that they know what is not required of them for guardianship. They are not required to provide funds out of their own pocket. They are not required to provide physical custody should anything happen to you if the person's over the age of 18, and even if they're under. And they're not responsible for your individual's actions and behaviors. A lot of the times this is a concern for people when agreeing to be guardians. And they're also not liable to harm that may be caused by a caregiver. So if there's somebody that's coming to the home to care for your individual and something should happen, it's not going to fall under the insurance or under the obligation of the guardian that you have appointed. Information on guardianship, this is another very important resource, www.guardianshipallianceofcolorado.org. Yes, this is a Colorado-specific resource, but it defines guardianship, just like the last blurb that I had up, and it also helps you to know about appointing them and the services that each person will provide for your individual, and how to approach selecting a guardian as well. So it's not a perfect world. You're going to encounter a lot of speed bumps. Crisis intervention requires persons who are specialized and have specialized skills. Not all counselors or behavioral health providers are crisis interventionists. So bear that in mind and ask your specific provider if they are willing to do that. If your person's over the age of 18, also ask them as well. Many professionals do not have the training and experience necessary to conduct competent crisis interventions. If your personal clinician does not have that experience, you do not want to employ their assistance within a crisis situation. It's not going to be helpful. You want to make sure that they have the ability to assess and intervene during emergencies. Most doctors, counselors, and psychotherapists have good intentions, but they don't realize that crisis situations are highly unstable and highly volatile, and that they're also very demanding. Incorrect assessment and missed opportunities or unskillful behavior and mistakes can prolong crisis. We talked about at the very beginning that it creates new problems, it causes trauma, and it turns an urgent problem into a dangerous and potentially hazardous emergency. In the entire field of mental health, bear in mind that crisis intervention has the highest incidence of negligence and malpractice that results in significant harm because crisis is an escalated situation and it's very unpredictable. Most of the negligence and malpractice in crisis intervention goes unrecognized by consumers and even professionals. You now know what crisis intervention should look like. Make sure that your clinician or whomever you're choosing to work with your individual is a crisis interventionist or knows how to do that. Most likely they will have a 24-hour line for you to contact, and that's very helpful. So we're looking in what to look for in selecting your clinician and somebody that's going to help you in a crisis situation. You want to make sure that your individual is competent in crisis intervention, that they have training in crisis intervention and emergency psychological services. They know how to handle them, they know how to respond to them, and they have a liaison established with your local community mental health network. They can be reached 7 days a week, 24 hours a day if necessary. That's huge. Like I said, not all counselors or mental health agencies provide that. If you feel that you may face crisis, this is a very important clinician that you want in your repertoire of resources. They can arrange for scheduled appointments up to 3 hours in advance or as frequently as three times a week, and they can also do extended sessions if needed. This is pretty important because if you're going to need a longer session, a lot of clinicians aren't going to be able to accommodate that. They're available for phone contact on a daily basis, which means they're available for consultation with law enforcement, with judges, with mental health providers, and with medical doctors. They have experience working within the emergency room, crisis and triage centers. Like I said, they need to have the liaison with those agencies in order to support and advocate for you. They have experience with routine as well as crisis services, so they're going to be able to do both. You don't just want a crisis interventionist that's going to pop up. You want to make sure you have a rapport and a good relationship with that person. They're going to have a knowledge of psychopharmacology. They don't need to be a doctor, but they're going to understand psychopharmacology, what its effects are, what its side effects are, and what the risks and benefits of use are, and be able to explain that to you if needed. They're also going to be experienced working with patients in psychiatric hospital settings. If they do not have a liaison with your community mental health center or your hospitals, they're not going to be privy to that type of engagement with your individual should that be needed. And also they are licensed in either medicine, social work, counseling, or psychology. And those are the best resources that you can have because they're really going to advocate. So you took in a lot of information. There's a lot to do. Where do you need to start? Of course, you need to start where your person's at. If your individual's 5, obviously you have some time, but there's some basic steps that you need to take. That's developing your written plans, developing your contingency plans, and also developing your resource numbers and lists. You want to also set up your community network, your resources, and your systems of support, and make sure that those are in place and ready should they be needed. It's never too early to get those in place. And of course, you also want to remember that person and environment will always drive your intervention. If your individual is in an environment that is unstable, that is what you change because that is going to affect everything around you. So the best thing you can do, start planning. It's going to be a long, tedious process, but the sooner you start, the more you have in place. And over time, you will develop more and more and be better prepared to deal with crisis and handle it should it occur in the future. Thank you for your time.